By early 1942, the waters between Borneo and Celebes had become a transit corridor for a fast-moving campaign whose center of gravity was industrial fuel. The Dutch East Indies contained major oil fields, refineries, and ports that were central to the regional balance of power. For Japan, the tightening of U.S., British, and Dutch embargo measures in 1940 to 1941 sharpened the incentive to seize and protect resource flows in Southeast Asia, while also denying those resources to opponents. For the Netherlands, whose government continued the war from exile, the Indies were both a vital economic base and a major operational theater. Local Dutch authorities, the KNIL, and naval forces faced the prospect of defending a dispersed archipelago with limited reinforcements arriving from outside the region. The geography of the Makassar Strait explains why it mattered. It separates eastern Borneo from Celebes and sits on approaches linking the Java Sea to the wider eastern archipelago. Control of nearby straits and seas governed how quickly invasion convoys could shift between Borneo, Celebes, and Java, and how easily Allied ships could interfere with those movements. In late January 1942, Japanese operations advanced in steps that aimed to convert captured ports and airfields into a chain of forward bases. Tarakan fell on the 11th to 12th of January 1942, Balikpapan was taken on the 23rd to 25th of January, and Kendari on southeast Celebes was captured on the 24th of January, giving Japan another airfield position from which land-based aircraft could influence sea lanes. These captures were not only territorial changes, they altered where aircraft could operate from, where ships could refuel and anchor, and how quickly follow-on landings could be supported. For the Allies, the same timeline produced a crisis of coordination. In January 1942, the American, British, Dutch, Australian command structure was created to integrate defense across a vast area, but it brought together forces that had different doctrines, equipment standards, communication systems, and operational priorities. Naval units in theater included Dutch cruisers and destroyers that had been based in the Indies for years. The U.S. Asiatic Fleet elements pushed south and west under pressure after the opening of the Pacific War, and British and Australian units moving through a deteriorating strategic situation in Malaya and the Netherlands East Indies. The intent was to concentrate limited naval power for convoy interception and local sea control, but the practical reality was that air cover, reconnaissance, and fighter coordination often lagged behind the speed of Japanese advances. This is the setting in which the Battle of the Makassar Strait developed, a naval force attempting to act on imperfect reconnaissance in seas increasingly exposed to land-based air power. Even the naming reflects the confusion of the campaign. The 4th of February 1942. Action is widely labeled the Battle of Makassar Strait, but it occurred south of the Kangean Islands in the Bali Sea, and is sometimes described under alternate names tied to nearby waters and straits. It is also sometimes confused with the separate 24th January 1942 action off Balikpapan that is occasionally given a similar label. The shared thread is strategic. As airfields and ports changed hands in January 1942, the balance between surface interception and air attack shifted rapidly, and decisions at sea were increasingly shaped by whether ships could operate without fighter protection within range of Japanese bombers. In the first days of February 1942, the operational problem for the Allied Naval Command in Java was time. Japanese forces had taken a sequence of airfields and ports on the eastern flank of the Netherlands East Indies, and intelligence pointed to further landings intended to widen the lodgment on Celebes and tighten control of routes toward Java. Within ABDA, the naval response relied on a familiar logic from earlier wars. Strike the transports before the landing force could unload heavy equipment and force the attacker to repeat the operation under pressure. The opening move was a sortie from the main Allied bases in Java toward the eastern approaches. A mixed striking force assembled around cruisers from the United States and the Netherlands, with destroyers as escort and screen. Command arrangements reflected the coalition structure. Dutch officers held overall responsibility for many local naval operations, while U.S. ships brought much of the available heavy gun power. The goal was interception, but the decision to sail was made under constraints that were already shaping the campaign: limited fighter cover over the route, incomplete reconnaissance of Japanese convoy positions, and an expanding envelope of Japanese land-based bomber range from newly captured airfields. As the ships pushed east, the operational picture remained uncertain. Reports of convoy movements were intermittent, and the straits and island chains created multiple possible routes for Japanese shipping. The Allied force had to balance speed and fuel consumption against the need to keep the group together for mutual defense. Radio discipline and the risk of air observation further complicated command and control, especially as the force moved into waters where Japanese aircraft could arrive before surface contact with any convoy. On February 4, 1942, the campaign's new reality arrived from the air. Imperial Japanese Navy land-based medium bombers, operating from forward airfields on Celebes, located the Allied force and began high-level attacks over open water. The engagement unfolded as a sequence of bombing runs rather than a surface gun battle. Anti-aircraft fire was intense but could not prevent near misses and direct hits. USS Marblehead was struck by bombs that caused major damage and casualties, including a compromised steering system that forced improvised measures to keep the ship under control. USS Houston avoided direct hits but suffered damage from near misses and shock effects, and the formation's cohesion was strained by the need to protect a damaged cruiser while still under threat of further air attack. The immediate operational consequence was a decision to break off the interception attempt. With one cruiser seriously damaged, the force faced a choice between pressing on with reduced combat effectiveness inside bomber range or withdrawing to preserve ships that could be decisive later. The withdrawal itself became a complex movement. The damaged ship required escort, speed was limited, and every mile westward had to be covered under the assumption that additional strikes could follow. Marblehead's subsequent passage to safer waters and eventual evacuation for repair became a visible indicator inside Allied planning circles of how quickly air power could neutralize surface action when fighter cover was absent. For Japanese commanders, the outcome validated the protective value of forward airfields even before major fleet units arrived. The transport and landing timetable did not need a decisive surface engagement. It needed the sea space around the convoys kept clear long enough to unload troops and supplies. For Dutch authorities and civilians in threatened ports, the air attack reinforced a grim pattern already seen at Tarakan and Balikpapan. The time available to organize evacuation, demolitions of installations, and local defense plans was shrinking, while the ability of Allied naval forces to intervene at the decisive point was increasingly contested from the air. For Japanese planners in early 1942, the Makassar Strait was less a single battlefield than a connective route inside a larger operational sequence. After landings on Tarakan and Balikpapan in January, the next steps aimed to secure additional ports and airfields that would tighten control of the sea space between Borneo, Celebes, and the approaches to Java. Contemporary Allied intelligence framed this as an invasion convoy assembling for further moves in the eastern Netherlands East Indies. Japanese operational objectives in this phase included taking Makassar and Banjarmasin to consolidate control of the strait, and support follow-on operations deeper into the archipelago. Allied planning inside ABDA began from a different set of constraints. The coalition's available heavy surface units in the Java area could still deliver concentrated gunfire against transports, but only if they found the convoy in time and could remain on station long enough to disrupt unloading. Air reconnaissance coverage was uneven, and fighter protection over the eastern routes was limited by airfield availability, aircraft serviceability, and the distances involved. The result was an interception concept that depended on speed, surprise, and short exposure. Sortie east, strike the convoy at night or in low visibility if possible, then withdraw before sustained air attack could build. The operational trigger came from a reconnaissance report indicating a sizable Japanese movement. On February 1st, Allied commanders received word of an invasion force at Balikpapan, described as including about 20 troop transports with cruiser and destroyer escorts preparing to sail. On February 2nd, senior ABDA naval leadership met at Palembang and approved forming a strike force, then organized it under Rear Admiral Karl Dorman the following day. This was not simply a tactical decision. It was a wager that a concentrated surface group could still impose costs on invasion timetables despite diminishing control of the air. Doorman's force reflected both the strengths and the compromises of ABDA naval concentration. The striking group assembled 4 cruisers, 2 Dutch and 2 American, and 7 destroyers drawn from Dutch and U.S. units. The screen was intended to provide submarine and torpedo boat defense, while the cruisers carried the gunfire needed to damage transports quickly. The decision to mass ships, however, also created a single, detectable target for air reconnaissance once it entered the bomber radius from Celebes. Japanese planning in the same period emphasized that vulnerability. Rather than waiting for a surface fleet engagement, Japanese naval air units relied on land-based medium bombers with the range to patrol and strike over open water from captured airfields. In the 4th February action, Allied estimates described roughly 37 to 45 attacking aircraft, while Japanese accounts reported about 60 land-based bombers committed, including Mitsubishi, G4M, and G3M types. This approach treated the sea as an extension of the airfield network. Once forward bases were taken, air power could reduce the freedom of Allied surface ships, even when no Japanese surface force was in direct contact. Logistics shaped the plan as much as doctrine. The ABDA strike force had to refuel en route, and refueling arrangements constrained timing, routing, and speed. Reconnaissance and radio security were also in tension. Reporting convoy sightings quickly improved the chance of interception, but radio transmissions increased the risk of direction finding and air observation. By 3rd February, the Allied formation had already been sighted by Japanese aircraft while refueling, which reduced the probability that a surface interception could be achieved without first surviving an air response. The battle that followed would therefore test not only gunnery or ship handling, but whether ABDA's interception model could function at all under sustained land-based air threat. The first direct contact in the Makassar Strait operation did not occur at gun range. It occurred when aircraft found the Allied formation before the cruisers could find the convoy. The force under Rear Admiral Karl Doorman was operating as a single surface group with 4 cruisers and 7 destroyers, moving through island waters where convoy routes were multiple and visual search was limited. The tactical premise was interception, but the practical requirement became survival under air attack long enough to continue the mission. USS Houston, operating alongside Marblehead, endured repeated near misses that produced splinter and shock effects, damaged fittings and equipment, and stressed the ship's readiness, even without a confirmed direct bomb hit in the same manner as Marblehead. The Dutch cruisers and destroyers were also under attack, and the formation's ability to maintain a clean anti-aircraft pattern was challenged by the need to maneuver independently to avoid bomb patterns. The engagement, therefore, became a contest between 2 operating logics: surface ships needing predictable formation movement for mutual defense, and air attack requiring the ships to break that predictability to survive. The immediate outcome was operational rather than territorial. The strike force did not reach the reported convoy concentration in time to engage transports. Instead, it absorbed damage, expended ammunition, and lost the initiative necessary for a short, decisive interception window. With 1 cruiser seriously damaged, Doorman's force faced a constrained set of options: continue eastward while still within bomber range and with reduced speed and maneuverability, or withdraw to preserve the remaining heavy ships for future operations. The decision to withdraw shifted the center of gravity back to logistics and repair. A damaged cruiser required escort, protected routing, and access to facilities capable of stabilizing the ship and treating casualties. For Japanese commanders, the engagement demonstrated that forward airfields could defend sea space without committing surface forces to a close action. The practical effect was to keep Allied cruisers away from the convoy routes at the moment when troop transports were most vulnerable. For Dutch and Allied authorities ashore, the same outcome translated into less time. Each unsuccessful interception increased the likelihood that subsequent landings would occur on schedule, which in turn reduced evacuation windows, shortened the time available for demolitions of fuel facilities, and narrowed the margin for reorganizing defenses on Java and in the remaining parts of the eastern archipelago. The air attack of February 4, 1942, turned an interception sortie into a repair and evacuation crisis that immediately affected what ABDA could attempt next. 2 cruisers had been damaged in a single morning. USS Marblehead, with steering crippled and internal systems disrupted, reached Cilacap on Java's south coast by controlling direction through differential engine speeds. The ship reported 15 dead or mortally wounded, and 84 seriously injured from the bombing. The port's facilities imposed their own limits. Marblehead could not be placed in the local dry dock, so repairs were restricted to temporary hull work and stabilizing critical systems rather than restoring full combat capability. USS Houston also returned to Cilacap with a different type of damage. A single 250-kilogram bomb destroyed her aft main turret. Contemporary accounts from the ship's own community histories describe 46 crewmen killed in that hit and dozens wounded. The effect was measurable in firepower. Houston remained operational, but with 1/3 of her main battery out of action, her role in any future surface engagement had to be recalculated alongside ammunition availability and anti-aircraft readiness. The handling of casualties exposed the civilian dimension of the campaign on Java. At Cilacap, the dead were buried locally, while the more seriously wounded were transferred by train to the Dutch-run Petronella Hospital in Yogyakarta. Medical care depended on a fragile network of rail movement, local hospital capacity, and the assumption that Java's interior would remain secure long enough for treatment. That assumption was already under pressure, as Japanese air raids had begun striking key Javanese targets, including Surabaya, and as the ring of captured airfields tightened around the island. Operationally, Dorman's striking force had lost time and freedom of action. The withdrawal meant that the reported Japanese transport movement was not disrupted at sea, and Japanese commanders could proceed with the next steps of their schedule with reduced risk of surface interference. On 9 February 1942, Japanese forces captured Makassar on southwest Celebes, an advance that reinforced control of the strait and improved the basing network supporting air patrols and bomber operations over the surrounding waters. Each additional airfield and port captured in this sequence reduced the distance Japanese aircraft had to fly to reach critical sea lanes and reduced the warning time available to ships operating from Java. Inside ABDA, the crisis sharpened a dilemma that had been present from the start: whether to commit scarce surface ships aggressively to disrupt landings or preserve them for a larger defense of Java and its approaches. Repairs, ammunition stocks, and the need to escort damaged units competed directly with the need to concentrate for battle. The result was not a pause in the campaign, but an acceleration of constraints. After February 4th, every sortie eastward carried a higher probability of air attack, while every ship withdrawn for repair reduced the coalition's ability to mass force at sea. By mid-February 1942, the Makassar Strait action had folded into a broader peak period of the Netherlands East Indies campaign, in which Abda's remaining sea power was forced into repeated, increasingly risky responses. The loss of freedom to operate in the eastern approaches after February 4th did not end Allied attempts at intervention, but it changed their profile. Sorties became shorter, more dependent on night movement, and more constrained by air threat and fuel availability. Japanese operations continued to convert captured ground into operational reach. The occupation of Makassar on 9 February placed another port and airfield site under Japanese control on southwest Celebes, strengthening surveillance over waters between Celebes and Borneo, and shortening flight distances to the Java Sea approaches. This was paired with continued movement of invasion and support forces through the island chains, supported by land-based bombers and fighters operating from forward fields. ABDA naval leadership responded by trying to contest the approach routes to Java with the forces still available. A key test came with the Japanese landing on Bali on the 19th of February 1942. Dorman led a night counterattack through the Bali Strait, an operation shaped by the same problem exposed at Makassar. Surface ships could reach a target area, but air power and coastal geography limited time on station and complicated coordination. In the Bali Strait action, the Dutch light cruiser HNLMS Tromp was damaged, and the destroyer HNLMS Piet Hein was sunk. Japanese destroyers were also damaged, but the landing was not reversed, and the capture of Bali increased Japanese ability to stage air operations closer to eastern Java. These events tightened the operational vice around Java. Japanese air raids intensified against ports, airfields, and infrastructure, while Allied commanders faced an arithmetic problem in ship numbers and readiness. Damaged cruisers required repair periods that could not be compressed. Destroyers were being lost faster than they could be replaced, and ammunition stocks were finite. ABDA's command structure was also under strain. It had to coordinate national contingents whose remaining ships were scattered among tasks, escorting convoys, moving evacuees, covering approaches, and attempting offensive sweeps. Each additional Japanese lodgment reduced the set of safe routes for these missions. The peak of the naval campaign arrived at the end of February. On February 27, 1942, Dorman led the main ABDA striking force into the Battle of the Java Sea, attempting to stop Japanese invasion convoys moving toward Java. Over several hours of maneuver and gunnery, ABDA lost the Dutch light cruisers HNLMS DA Ryder and HNLMS Java, the Dutch destroyer HNLMS Kortenaer, and later the British destroyer HMS Jupiter. Japanese losses in that engagement did not include a sunk cruiser or transport, and the invasion convoys continued toward their objectives. In the subsequent nights, the remaining Allied heavy units were hunted down in the Sunda Strait and surrounding waters. USS Houston and HMAS Perth were sunk on the night of February 28 to March 1st, while attempting to break out, and other Allied ships were destroyed or forced to withdraw. For civilians and administrators on Java, this naval peak translated into rapid changes on land. As Japanese landings began on March 1, 1942, at multiple points on Java, the Dutch colonial government and Allied commands accelerated evacuation of some personnel and the destruction of selected facilities, including oil installations, to prevent immediate use by the occupier. These measures competed with urgent humanitarian needs, moving wounded sailors from earlier actions, relocating families tied to the colonial administration and military, and coping with shortages as shipping routes were disrupted. In this compressed interval, the naval battles at sea, including Makassar Strait's demonstration of air vulnerability, became directly linked to the collapse of sea-based mobility for people, supplies, and evacuation plans. After the 4th of February air attack, both sides adapted quickly because the tactical conditions had been clarified. Surface interception without fighter cover could be detected, fixed, and damaged by land-based bombers before it reached transport targets. From that point, ABDA's naval operations increasingly resembled a series of constrained experiments in how to keep ships combat-capable long enough to influence a campaign that was being decided by airfields and schedules. On the Allied side, adaptation began with tactics and procedures. Cruisers and destroyers revised station-keeping and maneuver rules to reduce bomb aim predictability, relying on more frequent independent turns while still maintaining mutual anti-aircraft coverage. Destroyers were tasked more explicitly with smoke-laying drills, not only to screen withdrawals, but to complicate the visual phase of high-level bombing. Anti-aircraft fire control was adjusted to prioritize massed, timed barrages rather than dispersed individual aiming, reflecting the reality that bomber formations were often engaged at long range and high altitude. These changes consumed ammunition rapidly, which forced commanders to weigh each sortie against remaining stocks and the probability of follow-on attacks. Operational planning also shifted toward night movement. Interception concepts emphasized closing transport routes after dusk, exploiting darkness and the complexity of island coastlines to reduce reconnaissance effectiveness. This demanded more from navigation and communications. Coalition forces had to standardize signals for identification, station changes, and emergency maneuvers because night operations increased the risk of collision and friendly fire. The same conditions magnified hardware differences. Some ships had more modern fire control and search radar than others, and many relied primarily on visual lookout and limited optical equipment in tropical weather that could switch from clear skies to squalls in minutes. Logistics became a form of adaptation. After Makassar Strait, repair capacity inside Java became a strategic limiter. Damaged ships often required immediate temporary fixes rather than full restoration, patching splinter holes, reinforcing bulkheads, stabilizing steering systems, and restoring electrical distribution sufficient for propulsion and anti-aircraft batteries. This meant that ships could return to sea with reduced main battery capability or degraded maneuverability, changing how commanders could employ them in later actions. Fuel planning was also tightened. Sorties were increasingly shaped by the location of safe refueling points, the need to avoid daylight exposure in predictable sea lanes, and the requirement to reserve fuel for withdrawal if air attack developed. Japanese adaptation in the same period concentrated on making air power a reliable barrier against surface interference. The capture of forward airfields allowed bomber units to reduce transit time to patrol zones and to mount repeated strikes in a single day. Reconnaissance practices improved through the use of maritime search patterns, with aircraft tasked to locate and shadow surface groups until bombers arrived. Convoy protection planning increasingly integrated air and sea. Destroyer screens were expected to hold surface threats at distance, while land-based aircraft created a threat envelope that discouraged Allied cruisers from closing. The emphasis was not on sinking every ship, but on forcing the attacker to break off before reaching transport concentrations. These adjustments had a cumulative psychological and organizational effect on crews and commanders without requiring dramatization. For Allied sailors, the experience of repeated air alerts, high-speed maneuvering, and damage control readiness reduced rest cycles and increased mechanical wear at a time when spare parts were scarce. For Japanese air and naval units, the tempo of reconnaissance and strike missions demanded steady fuel supply and airfield servicing capacity, which in turn tied operational freedom to the ability of ground forces to secure and expand captured bases. On both sides, morale and confidence became closely linked to practical indicators. Whether aircraft arrived on time, whether ships could be repaired fast enough to sail again, and whether a coalition command system could translate fragmentary sightings into a usable intercept plan before the convoy had already reached its landing beaches. The turning point in the Makassar Strait action was not a single ship sinking or a change of possession on a map. It was the moment Allied commanders could no longer assume that a cruiser-led interception force could reach a transport convoy inside bomber range without being located and attacked first. On February 4, 1942, a force of 4 cruisers and 7 destroyers sailed with the intention of striking an invasion movement reported as roughly 20 transports with escorts. Before any surface contact occurred, Japanese land-based bombers operating from forward bases on Celebes attacked in repeated high-level runs. Allied accounts commonly describe about 37 to 45 attacking aircraft. Japanese accounts report about 60 committed bombers. In either case, the engagement established that air power could impose outcomes on surface plans even without a fleet action. The tactical results were concrete and immediate. USS Marblehead took multiple bomb hits and serious near-miss damage, suffered 15 dead or mortally wounded, and 84 seriously injured, and lost normal steering control, forcing withdrawal and emergency routing to repair facilities that could only provide limited work. USS Houston returned with a main battery turret disabled by a 250-kilogram bomb and reported 46 killed in that hit, reducing her gunnery capacity for later operations. These losses were not only casualties and damaged metal, they reduced the available set of ships that could be concentrated for the next interception attempt, and they forced escorts to be reassigned to protect damaged units rather than to screen future sorties. The operational consequence was a shift in how sea control would be decided in the theater. ABDA's surface strength depended on concentrating a small number of cruisers at the right point in time. Japanese momentum depended on keeping transport routes open long enough to land, and then converting each captured airfield into a new zone of air coverage. After February 4th, the second model expanded while the first model contracted. Every forward base in the Celebes and Borneo, ARC shortened bomber flight times, increased patrol density, and reduced the warning margin for ships leaving Java. The sea became less a maneuver space for surface interception and more a corridor whose usability was determined by the radius of land-based aircraft. For commanders, this turning point altered decision thresholds. A cruiser group contemplating another intercept now had to assume detection was likely, that withdrawal might be required before contact, and that ammunition and damage control endurance could become limiting factors before any transport was sighted. For Japanese commanders, the same turning point meant that convoy protection could be built around an air umbrella, rather than around forcing a surface engagement. The goal was not to destroy every enemy ship. It was to prevent surface interference during the hours when transports were unloading troops, vehicles, and supplies. The human and civilian repercussions followed the same logic. When surface interception failed, landings proceeded closer to schedule, and schedules mattered because they set the pace at which ports changed hands and airfields shifted allegiance. Each successful landing reduced the time available for evacuation of personnel, movement of wounded, relocation of administrative services, and the removal or demolition of fuel stocks and industrial equipment. In the weeks that followed, the campaign moved toward larger, decisive battles near Java, but the Makassar Strait engagement had already marked the moment when the balance of operational freedom tilted. The side that could extend its airfield network could restrict the other side's ability to use surface ships offensively in the same waters. In the days after the 4th of February 1942 air attack, ABDA naval operations entered a phase defined by subtraction. The immediate tactical problem was no longer how to find the reported transport movement, but how to keep the remaining cruisers and destroyers combat-capable, while the eastern approaches were increasingly covered by Japanese aircraft operating from newly captured bases. One damaged cruiser leaving the operational area reduced the coalition's ability to assemble a concentrated surface group and escort requirements diverted destroyers from offensive screening to protective duties. Japanese ground and naval forces used the same interval to convert momentum into positional control. The capture of additional ports and airfields on Celebes and nearby islands reduced flight distances to the Java Sea approaches and widened the area in which Allied surface groups could be attacked from the air before reaching convoy routes. This did not require continuous decisive engagements at sea. It required a steady sequence of landings and the rapid activation of captured airfields so that reconnaissance, fighter cover, and bomber strikes could be generated on predictable schedules. By late February, ABDA's surface fleet faced a narrowing set of options. If it stayed concentrated near Java, it could attempt to strike invasion convoys approaching the island, but it had to accept high exposure to air attack and the risk of losing ships faster than they could be repaired. If it dispersed or withdrew, it could preserve some units for later use from Australia or the Indian Ocean. But dispersal reduced the chance of stopping landings already underway. The coalition's decision-making was therefore shaped by time-distance arithmetic, fuel endurance, refueling points, daylight exposure windows, and the distance from Japanese airfields to the sea lanes it needed to cross. When Japanese forces began landing on Java on March 1, 1942, at multiple points, naval withdrawal and evacuation became intertwined. Remaining Allied ships attempted to move personnel, critical equipment, and selected evacuees while also trying to avoid becoming fixed targets for aircraft and submarines. On land, Dutch and Allied authorities accelerated the destruction or disabling of some installations to deny immediate use, while simultaneously trying to maintain rail and road movement for hospitals, administrative staff, and units still maneuvering in defense of the island. These choices produced uneven results. Some facilities were damaged enough to delay rapid exploitation, while other stocks and equipment could not be moved or destroyed in time. The end of combat operations in this theater was compressed into days. As Japanese ground forces pushed inland and secured key road junctions and airfields, the remaining window for organized naval support and large-scale evacuation closed. Ships that attempted to break out faced the same condition revealed at Makassar Strait. In waters within range of land-based air power, survival depended as much on not being found as on defensive fire once attacked. Units that did escape generally did so by avoiding contact, rather than defeating an opponent in a set-piece engagement. The political and humanitarian consequences became immediate. On March 8, 1942, Dutch forces on Java capitulated, ending organized resistance on the island and formalizing the transition from contested campaign to occupation. Large numbers of military personnel became prisoners of war, and many civilians connected to the colonial administration and Allied militaries entered systems of internment and forced relocation. For the wider Allied war effort, the loss of Java and the fragmentation of Abdié meant that surviving naval assets were reorganized around new bases and new command arrangements, shifting the center of gravity of Allied operations south toward Australia and west into the Indian Ocean. For Japan, the short-term outcome was operational access to a major resource region and a chain of bases extending across the former Dutch East Indies. The condition of those resources, however, depended on what had been captured intact and what had been disabled during the final days. The aftermath therefore combined military consolidation with urgent repair, security, and transport work, restoring port functions, reopening airfields, and attempting to convert territorial gains into predictable fuel and materials flows under wartime constraints. The Battle of the Makassar Strait is remembered less for a change of possession than for what it demonstrated about the interaction of airfields, reconnaissance, and surface ships in early 1942. On February 4, 1942, an ABDA striking force built around 4 cruisers and 7 destroyers attempted to intercept a reported Japanese convoy movement. The force was located and attacked by Japanese land-based bombers before it reached any convoy, and the mission was abandoned after major damage to USS Marblehead and reduced combat capability for USS Houston. In operational terms, the engagement confirmed that, in the Netherlands East Indies Theater, the side that extended its airfield network could restrict the movement of surface forces well beyond the immediate coastline. The immediate legacy was practical and measurable. Marblehead's bombing casualties and disabling damage removed a cruiser from the short list of ships ABDA could mass for later actions. Houston's loss of an aft main turret reduced her gunnery capacity during the final weeks before Java was invaded, even though she remained in service until her sinking in the Sunda Strait on the night of 28 February to 1 March 1942. In coalition planning, the Makassar Strait experience reinforced a pattern repeated in later February operations. Offensive sorties had to be timed for darkness and routed to minimize exposure, but they still operated under increasing bomber coverage as Japanese forces seized new airfields on Celebes, Bali, and elsewhere. For the Japanese side, the engagement's legacy lay in the validation of a combined approach that did not require decisive surface battle to protect invasion shipping. By using forward air bases to search for and strike surface groups, Japanese commanders could reduce the likelihood that Allied cruisers would reach transport concentrations during the unloading window. This method depended on the rapid capture and activation of airfields and on a reliable reconnaissance-to-strike cycle, tying naval outcomes directly to ground campaign tempo. In the broader campaign history, Makassar Strait is often treated as a precursor to the late February battles in the Java Sea and Sunda Strait, not because it determined those outcomes by itself, but because it clarified the constraints under which ABDA would fight them. When ABDA later attempted to stop the Java invasion convoys, its ships operated with fewer ready units, limited fighter cover, and a heightened expectation that air power would shape the battle space even before surface contact. The engagement also illustrates how terminology and memory can diverge from geography. The name Battle of the Makassar Strait is commonly applied to the 4th of February 1942 air attack, even though it occurred south of the Kangjian Islands in the Bali Sea, and it is sometimes confused with the separate 24th of January 1942 surface action off Balikpapan that is occasionally labeled similarly in popular summaries. For historians, this creates a recurring need to separate events by date, location, and participants rather than by title alone. In national and institutional memory, the battle's trace is carried through ship histories and crew records more than through public monuments. In the United States, Marblehead's damage, emergency navigation to safety, and later service are used as an example of damage control and endurance under air attack. Houston's February 1942 sequence is often narrated as a continuous operational arc from Makassar Strait damage through final loss at Sunda Strait. In Dutch naval history, the ABDA period is often framed as a concentrated, short campaign of coalition operations in which limited forces attempted to delay a schedule of landings across a wide archipelago. In Indonesia, the battle sits within the opening phase of a rapid transition from Dutch colonial rule to Japanese occupation, with local memory more frequently anchored to the consequences of occupation and wartime administration than to offshore naval actions. In long-term military significance, Makassar Strait contributed to a growing body of early war evidence that surface ships operating without friendly air cover faced high risk when within range of land-based bomber forces, especially when reconnaissance could locate them reliably. It did not end surface operations in the theater, but it narrowed the set of feasible options and accelerated the shift toward airfield-centric control of sea space in the Netherlands East Indies campaign.